Picture this. You're scrolling through ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs in a museum, and suddenly you realize that what looks like innocent religious art is actually, well, let's just say the Egyptians had a very different relationship with sexuality than your high school history teacher led you to believe. Those fertility rituals carved into temple walls, they weren't exactly praying for better crops, if you catch my drift. Tonight, we're diving into the steamy, bizarre, and surprisingly profound world of ancient Egyptian sexual mythology. Because apparently, even 4,000 years ago, humans were absolutely obsessed with getting it on. If you're ready to have your perception of ancient civilizations completely shattered while drifting off to sleep, you know what button to hit. Let's get uncomfortably educated. Let's start with perhaps the most awkward creation myth in human history. And trust me, that's saying something. Meet Atum, the Egyptian god who literally masturbated the universe into existence. Yes, you heard that right. While other cultures had their gods speaking worlds into being or crafting humans from clay, the Egyptians went with a different approach. According to the Heliopolitan creation myth, Atum emerged from the primordial waters of chaos called Nun. He was alone, completely alone, in an endless void of nothingness. Now, most creation stories would have the deity contemplate existence, maybe meditate on the nature of reality, but Atum got straight to business. The ancient texts describe how he took his phallus in his grasp, and through an act of divine self-pleasure, ejaculated the first two gods, Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. Think about that for a moment. The Egyptians believed that literally everything, the pyramids, the Nile, your morning coffee, that annoying neighbor's dog, all of it came from one god having a really, really good time by himself. It's simultaneously the most honest and the most bizarre origin story ever conceived. No metaphors, no flowery language, just divine masturbation creating reality. But here's where it gets interesting, and where our modern squeamishness blinds us to something profound. This wasn't just ancient Egyptians being crude. This was sophisticated theological thinking, wrapped in sexual imagery. The act of creation through self-pleasure represented the ultimate expression of divine self-sufficiency. Atum didn't need a partner, didn't require external validation or assistance. He was complete unto himself, capable of generating life through pure will and, well, physical expression. The symbolism runs deeper than you might expect. In Egyptian thought, the act of ejaculation wasn't just about pleasure, it was about the transfer of life force, the ka, from one being to another. When Atum climaxed, he wasn't just experiencing physical release, he was literally giving birth to consciousness, to the fundamental forces that would shape reality. Shu would become the air we breathe, Tefnut the moisture that makes life possible. Modern parallel? Think about how we describe creativity today. We talk about conceiving ideas, about thoughts coming to fruition, about the seeds of inspiration. The Egyptians just took this metaphor to its logical, anatomical conclusion. They understood that creation, whether artistic, spiritual, or literal, requires a kind of intimate, personal engagement with the unknown. And let's be honest, there's something refreshingly direct about it. While other mythologies dance around the messy physical realities of existence, the Egyptians said, nope, let's acknowledge that bodies matter, that physical pleasure is part of the divine experience, and that creation itself might be the ultimate orgasmic experience. The priests who preserved these stories weren't embarrassed teenagers giggling in the back of class. They were sophisticated theologians who understood that sexuality and spirituality weren't opposites. They were different expressions of the same fundamental life force. The phallus wasn't a source of shame, it was a sacred symbol of creative power, so sacred that it became one of the most important religious symbols in Egyptian culture. You can see this reverence in Egyptian art, where gods are often depicted with prominent erections, not as pornographic imagery, but as symbols of their creative potency. The god Min, in particular, was always shown in a state of arousal, representing fertility, regeneration, and the continuation of life. These weren't dirty pictures hidden away, they were displayed prominently in temples, considered as holy as any other religious imagery. But what does this tell us about how the ancient Egyptians viewed sexuality itself? Unlike many cultures that developed shame-based relationships with physical pleasure, the Egyptians saw sexual energy as fundamentally divine. It wasn't something to be repressed or hidden, it was something to be celebrated, understood, and integrated into spiritual practice. This perspective would influence everything from their burial practices to their understanding of the afterlife. Death wasn't the opposite of sexuality. It was simply another transformation of the same creative energy that had first expressed in that primordial moment of self-pleasure. The ancient texts describe Atum's creative act with a mixture of reverence and matter-of-fact acceptance that would make modern readers blush. But maybe that says more about us than about them. Maybe we've lost something essential in our squeamish separation of body and spirit, our insistence that the sacred must be sanitized. Let that sink in as we prepare to dive deeper into this fascinating world, where gods had genitals, where creation was erotic, and where the most profound mysteries of existence were explained through the language of sexual experience. If you thought Atum's solo performance was wild, wait until you hear about what might be history's first recorded case of artificial insemination, with a twist that would make even the most creative fertility clinic raise an eyebrow. This is the story of Isis, Osiris, and a golden phallus that literally saved the Egyptian afterlife. Our story begins with what might be the world's most dysfunctional family drama. Osiris, the god-king of Egypt, was beloved by everyone, including his wife Isis, who also happened to be his sister. Yes, divine incest was apparently no big deal in ancient Egypt, but Osiris had a brother, Set, who was consumed with jealousy over Osiris's popularity and power. Set was basically that relative who ruins every family gathering, except with actual murder involved. Set's plan was elaborate and cruel. He commissioned a beautiful chest, perfectly fitted to Osiris's measurements, and threw a party. During the festivities, he announced that whoever fit perfectly in the chest could keep it. When Osiris climbed in, because who doesn't love a good party game, Set slammed the lid shut, sealed it, and threw it into the Nile. Osiris drowned, and Set assumed he'd won the throne. But Set had underestimated Isis. This wasn't some passive goddess waiting to be rescued. This was a woman with serious magical skills, and absolutely zero patience for her brother-in-law's nonsense. She searched everywhere for Osiris's body, and when she finally found the chest, she brought it back to Egypt and hid it. But Set discovered the body, and in a fit of rage that would make a serial killer jealous, dismembered Osiris into 14 pieces, and scattered them across Egypt. Now here's where most myths would end with tragedy. But Isis wasn't done. She embarked on what might be history's first forensic investigation, methodically tracking down every piece of her husband's body. Think CSI Ancient Egypt, but with more magic and significantly higher emotional stakes. She found 13 pieces. The 14th, Osiris's penis, had been eaten by a fish in the Nile. This was a problem, because in Egyptian belief, you needed to be physically complete to enter the afterlife. No penis meant no resurrection, which meant no eternal rule over the underworld, which meant the entire cosmic order was basically screwed. But Isis was nothing if not resourceful. She crafted a perfect golden replica of Osiris's missing member, attached it to his reassembled body, and through her magical powers, brought him back to life just long enough to conceive a child. This golden phallus became one of the most sacred objects in Egyptian religion, representing not just male fertility, but the triumph of love and determination over death itself. The child conceived through this divine artificial insemination was Horus, who would grow up to defeat Set and restore order to Egypt. But think about what's really happening here. A woman using technology, admittedly magical technology, but still, to overcome biological limitations and continue her family line. Isis didn't accept that death meant the end of possibility. She literally engineered a solution. This story reveals something profound about Egyptian attitudes toward both sexuality and technology. They didn't see artificial enhancement as somehow unnatural or inferior to biological processes. The golden phallus wasn't a shameful substitute. It was a sacred improvement, blessed by the gods, and essential to cosmic order. Function mattered more than form, purpose more than origin. Modern fertility treatments, IVF, artificial insemination, donor conception, all follow this same principle that Isis established thousands of years ago. When biology fails, intelligence and determination can find another way. The Egyptians were surprisingly comfortable with the idea that human intervention could improve on natural processes, especially when it served the greater good. But there's another layer to this story that often gets overlooked. Isis didn't just conceive Horus. She raised him as a single mother while in hiding from Set, who was actively trying to kill them both. She was simultaneously a widow, a mother, a political refugee, and a revolutionary leader, planning the overthrow of a corrupt ruler. The Egyptians worshipped her, not just as a fertility goddess, but as the ultimate example of feminine power and resilience. The golden phallus became a symbol that appeared throughout Egyptian art and literature, representing not just sexual potency, but the idea that love could literally overcome death. It was displayed in temples, carried in religious processions, and worn as jewelry. Far from being embarrassed by the artificial nature of Horus's conception, the Egyptians celebrated it as proof of divine ingenuity. In a culture that would eventually build the pyramids, monuments that remain engineering marvels, this comfort with technological enhancement makes perfect sense. The Egyptians were innovators who believed that human cleverness was a gift from the gods, meant to be used to solve seemingly impossible problems. The story also established a template for Egyptian medicine that was remarkably advanced. Egyptian doctors became famous throughout the ancient world for their surgical skills, their pharmaceutical knowledge, and their willingness to attempt procedures that other cultures considered impossible. They approached the human body the same way Isis approached Osiris's resurrection, with a combination of spiritual reverence and practical problem-solving. When you really think about it, Isis's golden phallus was more than just a mythological plot device. It was a statement about the nature of reality itself, that the physical and spiritual worlds could be bridged through intelligent intervention, that technology and magic weren't opposites, but partners, and that determination could find a way around any obstacle, even death itself. But as we'll see, this was just the beginning of Egyptian sexual innovation. Just when you think Egyptian mythology can't get any weirder, along comes the story of Horus and Set's competition. Yes, competition, because apparently when two Egyptian gods couldn't settle their differences through traditional means like arm wrestling or a nice game of chess, they resorted to what can only be described as the world's first masturbation contest, and the fate of all Egypt hung in the balance. After Set murdered Osiris, he expected to rule Egypt uncontested, but Horus, now grown to adulthood, had other plans. The problem was, both gods had legitimate claims to the throne, and neither was backing down. So the other gods convened a divine tribunal to settle the matter once and for all. What followed was an 80-year legal battle that makes modern court cases look like speed dating. The gods tried everything. They held debates, examined evidence, consulted oracles. Set even challenged Horus to various contests. They raced boats made of stone. Horus won by secretly making his boat of painted wood. They fought as hippos. They hurled insults that probably made the other gods cover their ears. But nothing worked. The tribunal remained deadlocked. That's when Set proposed the most bizarre solution in legal history. He suggested that he and Horus should, well, let's just say they should prove their dominance through a very intimate contest. Set's logic, if you can call it that, was that whoever could ejaculate on the other would prove their superiority and win the throne. Yes, ancient Egyptian divine law apparently included provisions for sexual humiliation as a form of evidence. Now, before you write this off as pure absurdity, remember that in ancient Egyptian culture, semen was considered one of the most powerful substances in existence. It was literally liquid life force, divine energy, made manifest. To be covered in another male's ejaculate was to be symbolically conquered, feminized, and dominated. This wasn't just crude horseplay, this was serious magical warfare. Horus, being considerably younger and less experienced in divine politics, agreed to the contest. What happened next depends on which version of the story you read, but in the most detailed account, Set attempted to assault Horus while he slept. Horus, however, was cleverer than his uncle gave him credit for. He caught Set's semen in his hands and ran straight to his mother Isis with the evidence. Isis, who had apparently dealt with enough of Set's nonsense to last several eternities, flew into a rage. She cut off Horus's contaminated hands and threw them into the Nile, because in her mind it was better for her son to be temporarily handless than permanently humiliated. Then she grew him new hands through magic, because when you're a goddess of healing, regenerating limbs is apparently no big deal. But Isis wasn't finished. She had Horus masturbate onto her hand. Then she snuck into Set's garden and spread Horus's semen on Set's favorite lettuce. Set, being apparently unobservant about his salad ingredients, ate the lettuce and unknowingly consumed Horus's essence. When the gods reconvened to hear the results of the contest, Set smugly announced that he had dominated Horus and should be declared the winner. The gods called upon Set's semen to testify to its location, and the semen answered from the marsh where Isis had thrown Horus's severed hands. Then they called upon Horus's semen, expecting it to emerge from Horus's body and confirm his humiliation. Instead, Horus's semen answered from inside Set's body. The divine tribunal erupted in chaos. Set had been symbolically penetrated and impregnated by his nephew. In the cosmic order of ancient Egypt, this made Set the passive partner, the one who had been conquered and dominated. The gods declared Horus the winner, and Set was forever marked as the one who had been sexually bested by his younger rival. But here's what makes this story more than just ancient comedy. It reveals how the Egyptians understood the relationship between sexuality, power, and cosmic order. The contest wasn't really about physical domination. It was about who had the superior claim to divine authority. In Egyptian thought, the ability to penetrate represented the active, creative principle that rulers needed to govern effectively. The story also shows us something remarkable about Egyptian attitudes toward cunning versus brute force. Horus didn't win through superior strength or size. He won through intelligence, planning, and having a really clever mother. The Egyptians valued wit over warrior strength, suggesting a culture that prized mental agility as much as physical prowess. Modern parallels aren't hard to find. Think about contemporary politics, where personal scandals can destroy careers and sexual impropriety becomes a weapon of political warfare. The Egyptians just took this dynamic to its logical mythological conclusion, where cosmic authority could be determined by who got whom to consume whose bodily fluids. There's also something profoundly modern about Isis's role in the story. She's the power behind the throne, the strategic mastermind who turns the tables on the aggressor. She doesn't just protect her son, she engineers his victory through careful planning and flawless execution. In a world where women were often relegated to passive roles, Isis emerges as the ultimate political operative. The contest between Horus and Set became one of the most popular stories in Egyptian literature, retold and elaborated upon for thousands of years. It was painted on tomb walls, carved in temple reliefs, and told around evening fires. The Egyptians weren't embarrassed by its sexual content. They celebrated it as a story about justice triumphing over tyranny through clever planning and divine intervention. And, perhaps most importantly, it established a principle that would govern Egyptian kingship for millennia. True authority comes not from force or birthright alone, but from the ability to outwit your opponents and win the approval of the gods through both strength and cunning. But wait until you hear how they celebrated the god Min. Meet Min, the Egyptian god who turned salad ingredients into sex symbols and made agricultural festivals significantly more interesting than your average county fair. If you've ever wondered why ancient Egyptians were so enthusiastic about lettuce cultivation, well, let's just say it wasn't because they were particularly concerned about their fiber intake. Min was the Egyptian god of fertility, reproduction, and what we might politely call masculine vigor. He was typically depicted as a mummified figure, with an impressively prominent erection, holding a flail in one hand, while his other hand was occupied elsewhere. Unlike other fertility gods who used symbols or metaphors, Min was refreshingly direct about his domain. His message was clear: fertility was serious business, and he was very good at his job. But here's where it gets interesting, and where lettuce enters our story. The Egyptians believed that lettuce was an aphrodisiac, a belief that seems bizarre until you understand their reasoning. When you cut a fresh lettuce stem, it releases a milky white sap that the Egyptians thought resembled semen. Therefore, in their beautifully logical minds, lettuce must enhance male fertility and sexual performance. This wasn't just folk medicine, it became central to Min's worship. During the festival of Min, held annually during harvest time, the pharaoh himself would participate in ceremonies that celebrated both agricultural abundance and human fertility. The festival began with the pharaoh cutting the first sheaf of grain, symbolically ensuring the land's continued productivity. Then things got significantly more personal. The pharaoh would enter Min's temple and, in a ritual witnessed by high priests and nobles, demonstrate his own fertility in honor of the god. Ancient text describes ceremonies where the ruler would masturbate publicly, his ejaculation seen as a guarantee that both the land and its people would remain fertile and prosperous. Imagine explaining that to your modern political science professor. But this wasn't considered crude or embarrassing, it was seen as one of the pharaoh's most important royal duties. The king's sexual potency was directly linked to the kingdom's prosperity. A pharaoh who couldn't perform was a pharaoh who couldn't rule, because his sexual energy was what maintained the cosmic balance that kept Egypt functioning. The lettuce connection became so strong that Min was often called Lord of the Lettuces, and his sacred gardens were filled with carefully tended lettuce beds. Priests would harvest the lettuce at peak freshness and offer the milky sap to worshippers seeking enhanced fertility. Egyptian medical piperi include dozens of recipes, combining lettuce juice with other ingredients to create fertility potions for both men and women. Modern science has actually vindicated some of this ancient wisdom. Lettuce does contain compounds that can affect hormone production, and the milky latex from certain lettuce varieties has been found to have mild psychoactive properties. The Egyptians may have been more observant about plant chemistry than we give them credit for. Min's festivals weren't solemn religious ceremonies. They were joyous celebrations that combined religious devotion with what can only be described as ancient Egyptian spring break. People came from across the kingdom to participate in fertility rituals, eat sacred lettuce, and engage in activities that would make modern festival organizers require extensive liability waivers. The goddess Isis often appeared alongside Min during these festivals, representing the feminine principle of fertility. Together, they embodied the Egyptian understanding that reproduction required both male and female energy working in harmony. This wasn't just about male sexual prowess, it was about the cosmic dance between opposing forces that created and sustained life. Archaeological evidence from Min's temples reveals some fascinating details about these celebrations. Excavations have uncovered thousands of small clay phalluses that were apparently offered to Min as votive gifts. People would bring these miniature replicas, often inscribed with prayers for fertility, sexual health, or successful pregnancies. Some were small enough to wear as amulets, others were large enough to, well, use your imagination. The priests of Min developed sophisticated rituals around lettuce cultivation that sound like ancient agricultural science. They tracked lunar cycles, monitored soil conditions, and maintained detailed records of which varieties produced the most potent sap. These weren't superstitious farmers throwing seeds and hoping for the best. They were methodical researchers studying the relationship between plant chemistry and human sexuality. Min's influence extended far beyond fertility festivals. He was considered the protector of travelers, particularly those journeying through the desert, because his life-giving energy could sustain people through harsh conditions. Caravans would carry Min amulets and make offerings of lettuce and beer at roadside shrines dedicated to him. The god's popularity wasn't limited to Egypt. As trade expanded, Min's cult spread throughout the Mediterranean, where he merged with local fertility deities and adapted to new cultural contexts. Greek and Roman sources describe Egyptian festivals of Min with a mixture of fascination and bewilderment, clearly impressed by the Egyptians' uninhibited approach to celebrating sexuality. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Min's worship was how it normalized discussions of sexual health and dysfunction. Egyptian medical texts describe treatments for impotence, premature ejaculation, and infertility with the same clinical detachment they applied to broken bones or stomach ailments. Sexual problems weren't shameful secrets, they were medical conditions that could be addressed through proper treatment and divine intervention. The lettuce connection even influenced Egyptian cuisine. Recipes survive for elaborate salads that were served at fertility banquets, combining lettuce with other supposed aphrodisiacs like honey, almonds, and certain spices. These weren't just meals, they were carefully crafted pharmaceutical preparations designed to enhance sexual performance and increase the likelihood of conception. Min's legacy reminds us that the ancient world wasn't as prudish as we sometimes imagine. The Egyptians understood something we are still learning, that sexual health is fundamental to overall well-being, that fertility affects entire communities, and that sometimes the most profound religious experiences involve acknowledging our basic biological needs and celebrating them as divine gifts. And speaking of divine gifts, wait until you hear about the goddess who made masturbation a sacred duty. If Min was Egyptian masculinity unleashed, then Hathor was femininity perfected, and she had some very progressive ideas about women's sexual autonomy that would make modern feminists nod in approval. Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, music, and motherhood, presided over what might be history's most enlightened approach to sacred sexuality, where pleasure wasn't just permitted, it was a religious obligation. Hathor's temples weren't your typical places of worship. They were more like ancient Egyptian spas combined with theological seminaries, staffed by priestesses who were trained in arts that most modern universities don't offer in their curriculum. These weren't ordinary clergy, they were sacred prostitutes, women who served the goddess by providing sexual services to worshippers as a form of divine communion. Before you let modern prejudices cloud your judgment, understand that sacred prostitution in ancient Egypt was nothing like modern sex work. These priestesses held positions of enormous respect and influence. They were educated, wealthy, and considered essential to the spiritual health of the community. Having sex with a priestess of Hathor wasn't just physical gratification. It was a religious sacrament that connected worshippers directly to the divine feminine principle. The priestesses underwent years of training that would put modern medical schools to shame. They studied anatomy, psychology, music, dance, poetry, and what ancient texts delicately call the arts of pleasure. They learned to read people's emotional and spiritual needs, to provide comfort and healing through intimate connection, and to channel the goddess's power through their bodies. Hathor herself was often depicted as a cow, or a woman with cow's ears, which might seem unsexy until you understand Egyptian symbolism. Cows represented nourishment, fertility, and gentle strength, the maternal aspects that the Egyptians considered the foundation of civilization. Hathor was the cosmic mother who fed the world through her milk and her love, providing both physical and spiritual sustenance. Her festivals were legendary affairs that combined religious devotion with what can only be described as ancient Egyptian Burning Man. The Festival of Drunkenness, held annually in Hathor's honor, involved massive communal celebrations where participants drank beer, listened to music, danced, and engaged in activities that would scandalize modern religious leaders, but were considered essential to spiritual health. The ancient texts describe these festivals with remarkable detail. Participants would arrive at Hathor's temples dressed in their finest clothing, bringing offerings of beer, bread, and perfume. The celebration began with music and dancing that gradually became more ecstatic as the night progressed. Priestesses would select partners from among the worshippers, and the sexual unions that followed were considered sacred rituals that blessed both participants and ensured the goddess's continued favor. But this wasn't random hedonism, it was carefully orchestrated spiritual practice. The priestesses were trained to recognize people's deepest needs and provide exactly the kind of healing they required. Someone suffering from grief might receive gentle, comforting intimacy. Someone struggling with confidence might experience passionate affirmation. The sexual encounter was tailored to serve the person's spiritual development. Egyptian medical papier reveal that Hathor's priestesses were also skilled healers who specialized in women's health issues. They provided contraception, abortion services, and treatments for sexual dysfunction. They were midwives, therapists, and sex educators, rolled into one. Women would come to Hathor's temples, not just for spiritual guidance, but for practical advice about their bodies and their relationships. The goddess herself was considered the ultimate example of female sexual agency, unlike many ancient deities who were defined by their relationships to male gods. Hathor was autonomous, powerful, and unapologetically sensual. She took lovers when and where she chose, enjoyed physical pleasure without shame, and used her sexuality as a source of power rather than submission. This had profound implications for how Egyptian women understood their own sexuality. In a culture where women in many other societies were considered property, Egyptian women had remarkable freedom to pursue sexual relationships, initiate divorces, and control their reproductive choices. Hathor's example legitimized female desire and established the principle that women's pleasure mattered just as much as men's. The priestesses developed sophisticated techniques for enhancing sexual pleasure that sound remarkably modern. They used massage oils infused with herbs, practiced what we might now call tantric techniques for extending and intensifying orgasms, and maintained detailed knowledge of human anatomy that rivaled contemporary medical understanding. Ancient Egyptian sex manuals, written by Hathor's priestesses, include instructions that would fit right into modern sexuality guides. Archaeological evidence from Hathor's temples reveals the extent of their influence. Excavations have uncovered libraries containing thousands of texts on medicine, psychology, and sexual techniques. There are workshops where priestesses prepared cosmetics, perfumes, and medicinal preparations. There are dormitories where they lived and studied, and meeting halls where they counseled couples and provided sexual education. The economic impact was enormous. Hathor's temples were among the wealthiest institutions in Egypt, supported not just by religious donations, but by the fees paid for the priestesses' services. This wasn't exploitation, it was a sophisticated system that provided women with economic independence and social status, while serving essential community needs. But perhaps most remarkably, the cult of Hathor established the principle that sexual pleasure was a divine right, not a privilege granted by others. Both men and women were encouraged to pursue satisfaction, to explore their desires, and to understand their bodies as temples worthy of worship and care. The priestesses weren't just service providers. They were teachers who helped people develop healthier relationships with their own sexuality. They taught techniques for overcoming inhibition, for communicating desires, and for achieving the kind of intimate connection that modern sex therapists spend years training to facilitate. When Greek and Roman visitors encountered Hathor's temples, their reactions ranged from shock to fascination to conversion. Some dismissed the practices as barbaric, but others recognized them as representing a more enlightened approach to human sexuality than anything their own cultures had developed. The legacy of Hathor's sacred prostitution reminds us that the relationship between sexuality and spirituality doesn't have to be antagonistic. The Egyptians understood that physical pleasure could be a pathway to transcendence, that sexual healing was real healing, and that honoring the body was just as important as honoring the spirit. But not all Egyptian sexual practices were quite so enlightened. Wait until you hear about their mummification fetish. Death, for most cultures, marks the end of earthly pleasures. But the ancient Egyptians had other ideas entirely. They believed that the afterlife should be even better than mortal existence, and that definitely included maintaining an active sex life for eternity. This led to some of the most elaborate burial preparations in human history, and some practices that would make modern funeral directors seriously reconsider their career choices. The Egyptian concept of the afterlife, known as the duet, wasn't some ethereal realm where souls floated around playing harps. It was a fully realized parallel universe, where the dead continued to live, work, eat, and yes, have sex, just in improved circumstances. Think of it as ancient Egyptian heaven, but with significantly better amenities and zero performance anxiety. This belief had profound implications for mummification practices. The goal wasn't just to preserve the body, it was to ensure that the deceased would be sexually functional in the afterlife. Male mummies were often prepared with their penises erect, maintained through careful positioning and stuffing techniques that morticians developed into high art. Some mummies were equipped with artificial phalluses made of gold or precious stones, because apparently even death was no excuse for inadequate equipment. Female mummies received equally careful attention to their sexual organs, with particular care taken to preserve the breasts and genitalia. Morticians used special resins and oils that were believed to maintain the body's capacity for pleasure. Some wealthy women were buried with elaborate dildos made of ivory, ebony, or precious metals, because eternal paradise apparently required backup options. The tomb paintings that decorated burial chambers often included explicit sexual scenes, not as pornographic decoration but as instruction manuals for the afterlife. These weren't hidden away in dark corners. They were prominently displayed alongside scenes of farming, hunting, and daily life, because sexual activity was considered just as essential to post-mortem existence as any other basic need. Archaeological excavations have revealed caches of erotic pipery, buried with the dead, including detailed illustrations of sexual positions and techniques that the deceased could reference in the afterlife. The Turin erotic papyrus, one of the most famous examples, contains 12 explicit scenes of couples engaged in various sexual activities, with accompanying text that reads like an ancient Egyptian Kama Sutra. But the most fascinating aspect of Egyptian afterlife sexuality was their belief in spiritual reproduction. The dead weren't just having sex for pleasure, they could actually conceive and bear children in the underworld. These spiritual offspring would serve as helpers and companions for their parents throughout eternity, creating extended families that spanned multiple realms of existence. This led to elaborate rituals designed to ensure fertility in the afterlife. Wealthy Egyptians were buried with fertility amulets, aphrodisiac foods, and even live servants whose job was to facilitate their master's sexual needs in the next world. Some tomb complexes included specialized chambers equipped with beds, oils, and other accessories for posthumous intimacy. The goddess Nut, who ruled over the night sky and the realm of the dead, was often depicted in tomb paintings stretching naked over the deceased, her body forming the canopy of heaven. But this wasn't just decorative symbolism. The Egyptians believed that Nut would literally embrace the dead with her body, providing both protection and sexual comfort during their journey through the underworld. Egyptian funeral texts include detailed instructions for maintaining sexual vitality after death. The deceased were taught spells to ensure their continued attractiveness, maintain their fertility, and even enhance their performance beyond what they had achieved in life. Death, in the Egyptian view, was an opportunity for sexual improvement, not cessation. The Book of the Dead contains several chapters specifically devoted to sexual function in the afterlife. Chapter 99, for example, includes a spell for bringing a ferry boat in the realm of the dead, but the accompanying illustrations make it clear that this ferry boat is actually a metaphor for sexual arousal, and the journey refers to achieving orgasm in the spiritual realm. Wealthy Egyptians sometimes arranged for their mummies to be buried in copulating positions with their spouses, ensuring that their sexual connection would continue into eternity. Archaeological evidence suggests that some couples were mummified while actually engaged in sexual intercourse, their bodies preserved in positions that would maintain their physical union throughout eternity. The process of mummification itself became eroticized, with embalmers developing techniques specifically designed to enhance the sexual appeal of corpses. Bodies were positioned to emphasize attractive features, stuffed to maintain shapely contours, and treated with cosmetics and perfumes that would preserve their desirability. The wealthy paid premium prices for embalmers who specialized in these enhanced preservation techniques. Egyptian afterlife beliefs also included the concept of sexual resurrection, the idea that the dead could return to the world of the living specifically for intimate encounters with their surviving spouses. Widows and widowers were encouraged to maintain shrines in their homes where their deceased partners could manifest for conjugal visits. These weren't considered ghost stories or supernatural encounters. They were natural expressions of love that transcended death. The practical implications of these beliefs shaped Egyptian society in unexpected ways. Marriages were often structured to continue into the afterlife, with detailed contracts specifying the couple's obligations to each other in both worlds. Some agreements included provisions for spiritual divorce, allowing couples to separate in the afterlife if their posthumous relationship became unsatisfactory. Egyptian medical texts describe treatments for sexual dysfunction that were specifically designed to work in both life and death. Physicians developed potions and procedures that they claimed would restore sexual function even after mummification, ensuring that their patients would enter the afterlife with full capacity for pleasure. This comprehensive approach to posthumous sexuality reveals something profound about Egyptian attitudes toward death and desire. They refused to accept that mortality should limit human experience, instead developing elaborate systems to ensure that the most fundamental aspects of existence, including sexual pleasure, would continue forever. The result was a culture that approached death, not with fear and resignation, but with anticipation and careful planning. Death wasn't the end of pleasure, it was the beginning of perfect, eternal satisfaction. But achieving that perfect afterlife required navigating some very specific and rather kinky divine requirements. Royal incest. It's a practice that makes modern people uncomfortable, and ancient Egyptians absolutely triumphant. For over 3,000 years, Egyptian pharaohs regularly married their sisters, daughters, and sometimes even their mothers, all in the name of maintaining divine bloodlines and cosmic order. What seems taboo to us was, to them, the most sacred duty a ruler could perform. The practice wasn't born from twisted desire or primitive ignorance. It was sophisticated theology made flesh. The Egyptians believed that pharaohs were literally gods incarnate, living embodiments of divine power on earth. Regular human blood would dilute this divine essence, potentially weakening the connection between the mortal and spiritual realms that kept Egypt functioning. Think about the mythological precedent. Isis and Osiris were siblings who married and produced Horus, the model for all pharaohs. Geb and Nut, the earth and sky gods, were brother and sister. The entire Egyptian pantheon was essentially one big, interconnected family tree, where incest wasn't just common. It was the standard operating procedure for divine reproduction. But this wasn't random family dysfunction elevated to religious practice. Egyptian royal incest followed carefully established rules designed to preserve specific bloodline characteristics while minimizing the genetic problems that modern science knows can result from inbreeding. Royal families maintained detailed genealogical records going back centuries, tracking which combinations of royal blood produced the healthiest and most capable rulers. The pharaoh typically had one primary wife, his great royal wife, who was usually his sister or half-sister. This woman would bear the heir to the throne, ensuring that the next pharaoh would have the maximum concentration of divine blood possible. Secondary wives, who were often foreign princesses or Egyptian nobles, provided political alliances and additional heirs, but their children were considered less divinely qualified to rule. Archaeological evidence suggests that Egyptian royal families were remarkably successful at avoiding the worst genetic consequences of inbreeding. Recent DNA analysis of royal mummies shows that while there was definitely close intermarriage, the bloodlines were periodically refreshed through marriages with carefully selected noble families who could trace their ancestry back to earlier dynasties. The wedding ceremonies themselves were elaborate affairs that combined political theatre with religious ritual. The marriage wasn't just joining two people, it was renewing the cosmic contract that kept the universe running smoothly. The pharaoh and his sister bride would undergo ceremonies that explicitly connected their union to the mythological marriage of Isis and Osiris, with the bride taking on Isis's role as the divine mother and the pharaoh embodying Osiris's power. These weren't marriages of convenience or political necessity. Contemporary accounts describe genuine love and affection between royal siblings who had been raised specifically for this purpose. From childhood, potential royal couples were educated together, taught to see their future marriage as the culmination of their divine destiny rather than an obligation to be endured. The sexual aspect of these relationships was considered especially sacred. The pharaoh and his sister wife were believed to recreate the cosmic forces that maintained the balance between order and chaos. Their sexual union literally sustained the universe, making their intimate moments matters of national and spiritual importance. Palace documents reveal that royal couples received extensive sexual education from temple priests and priestesses who specialized in sacred sexuality. They learned techniques for maximizing pleasure and fertility, were taught to view their physical relationship as a form of worship, and were given detailed instruction in the rituals that should accompany their intimate encounters. The queen's role extended far beyond producing heirs. As the pharaoh's divine counterpart, she wielded enormous political and religious power. She often served as high priestess of major temples, commanded her own military forces, and could rule in her own right if necessary. The sibling marriage wasn't about male domination. It was about creating a divine partnership between equals. Some royal couples became legendary for their devotion to each other. Akhenaten and Nefertiti, though not siblings, embodied the ideal of divine marriage partnership. Their tomb art shows them in intimate, affectionate poses that were unprecedented in royal iconography, suggesting a relationship that combined political alliance with genuine romantic love. The practice had fascinating legal implications. Egyptian law generally prohibited incest among common citizens, but royal families were literally above such restrictions because they operated under divine rather than human law. This created a two-tiered system where different rules applied based on one's relationship to the gods. Foreign visitors to Egypt were often shocked by royal incest, but Egyptian responses suggest they found foreign marriage customs equally bizarre. How could a pharaoh maintain divine purity by marrying a foreign princess with no divine blood? How could kingdoms survive when their rulers diluted their divine authority through marriages with mortals? The system worked remarkably well for millennia. Egypt remained stable and powerful under dynasties that practiced systematic royal incest, suggesting that whatever genetic risks existed were successfully managed through careful breeding programs and periodic introduction of new bloodlines from cadet branches of royal families. But the practice also created unique psychological dynamics. Royal children grew up knowing that their siblings were potential spouses, that their family relationships would eventually become sexual relationships, and that their personal desires were secondary to divine necessity. Palace records suggest that this created individuals who were remarkably mature about sexuality and politics, but sometimes struggled with concepts of romantic love as understood by common people. The end of the practice came gradually, as Egypt came under foreign influence, and eventually foreign rule. Greek and Roman conquerors found royal incest repugnant, and gradually replaced it with marriage customs from their own cultures. By the time of Cleopatra, who famously married two of her brothers, the practice had become more political theatre than religious conviction. But for thousands of years, Egyptian royal incest represented one of the most successful attempts in human history to systematically blend sexuality, spirituality, and politics into a coherent system of governance. It was weird, it was systematic, and remarkably, it actually worked. The legacy of these sacred marriages influenced Egyptian attitudes towards sexuality for generations, establishing principles about the connection between intimate relationships and cosmic order that would shape the culture long after the last pharaoh had been buried. Speaking of burial practices, wait until you hear what the Egyptians believed about sex with the dead. Content warning, We're about to explore one of the most unsettling aspects of ancient Egyptian sexuality, their remarkably casual attitude toward necrophilia. What modern society considers one of the ultimate taboos was, in ancient Egypt, sometimes viewed as a sacred act of devotion, resurrection magic, or simply good customer service in the afterlife industry. The story begins, as so many Egyptian sexual tales do, with Isis and Osiris. Remember, Isis didn't just resurrect her husband, she had sex with his reassembled corpse to conceive Horus. This wasn't presented as disturbing or unnatural. It was the ultimate expression of love transcending death. Isis's necrophilic encounter with Osiris became the template for a whole range of Egyptian practices that would make modern morticians file restraining orders. Egyptian embalmers, those skilled artisans who prepared bodies for the afterlife, were apparently not always as professional as their reputation suggests. Historical accounts, including one particularly detailed report by the Greek historian Herodotus, describe how embalmers would sometimes engage in sexual acts with the corpses of beautiful women before beginning the mummification process. But this wasn't simple perversion. It was based on religious beliefs about the preservation of life force. The Egyptians believed that sexual energy was so powerful it could literally animate dead tissue, potentially helping to preserve the soul's connection to the body. An embalmer who had sex with a fresh corpse wasn't just satisfying twisted desires. He was performing what he considered a valuable service that would improve the deceased's prospects in the afterlife. The practice became so common that wealthy families would sometimes specifically request embalmers who were known for this particular service, paying premium prices for what they considered enhanced preservation techniques. Some families would even witness the process, believing that the sexual energy generated would create a stronger connection between the living and the dead. Egyptian medical texts describe necrophilia as a legitimate treatment for certain spiritual ailments. Men who suffered from impotence or fertility problems were sometimes advised to have sex with fresh corpses, particularly those of women who had died in childbirth. The belief was that the lingering life force in recently deceased bodies could transfer fertility and sexual vitality to the living. Women weren't excluded from these practices. Wealthy widows sometimes arranged for sexual encounters with the preserved bodies of their deceased husbands, believing this would maintain their spiritual connection and ensure the husband's continued presence in their lives. These weren't considered desperate acts of grief-stricken individuals. They were recognized religious practices with established protocols and procedures. The goddess Nephthys, sister to Isis, and associated with death and mourning, was often invoked during necrophilic rituals. Worshippers believed that she would guide and bless sexual encounters with the dead, ensuring that the acts served spiritual rather than merely physical purposes. Temples dedicated to Nephthys maintained special chambers where such encounters could take place under proper religious supervision. Archaeological evidence from certain burial sites suggests that necrophilia was incorporated into formal funeral rites for some elite families. Excavations have revealed tombs with specialized alcoves containing beds, oils, and other accessories that appear designed for sexual encounters between mourners and the deceased. These weren't hidden or shameful spaces, they were prominent features of expensive burial complexes. The practice extended to the cult of Osiris, where priests would sometimes engage in ritual necrophilia during religious festivals, commemorating the god's death and resurrection. These acts were performed publicly during certain ceremonies, with participants believing they were literally recreating the cosmic drama that maintained universal order. Egyptian law contained specific provisions governing necrophilia, which tells us something important. It was common enough to require legal regulation. The laws distinguished between consensual necrophilia, where the deceased had agreed to the practice before death, or where family members had arranged it, and non-consensual necrophilia, sexual assault of corpses without permission, with different penalties for each category. Professional necrophiles, people who specialized in sexual encounters with the dead, operated as legitimate service providers in some Egyptian cities. They were trained in proper techniques for preserving corpses during sexual activity, understood the religious significance of their work, and maintained client relationships with families who regularly used their services. The practice had interesting gender dynamics. Male necrophiles were generally seen as providing a service to female corpses and their families, while female necrophiles were often viewed as maintaining connections with deceased male relatives. The sexual encounters weren't random acts of perversion. They were structured interactions based on pre-existing relationships and religious obligations. Some Egyptian medical texts suggest that necrophilia was believed to have therapeutic benefits for the living participants. Sexual encounters with corpses were prescribed as treatments for various psychological and spiritual ailments, from depression to spiritual possession. The theory was that the boundary-crossing nature of the act could reset the participants' spiritual energy and restore psychological balance. The decline of Egyptian necrophilia came gradually as foreign influences introduced different attitudes toward death and sexuality. Greek and Roman occupiers found the practice repugnant and gradually suppressed it through legal and social pressure. Christian influences later reinforced these prohibitions, associating necrophilia with demonic possession and spiritual corruption. But for over 2 millennia, sexual contact with the dead was a recognized, regulated, and sometimes celebrated aspect of Egyptian culture. It represented the ultimate expression of their belief that death was simply another state of existence rather than an end to human experience and relationships. Modern psychology might interpret these practices as expressions of grief, denial, or sexual deviation, but the Egyptians would have found such interpretations puzzling. To them, necrophilia was simply another form of communication between the living and dead, no more disturbing than talking to spirits or offering food to ancestral ghosts. The legacy of Egyptian necrophilia reminds us how profoundly different attitudes toward death and sexuality can be. What seems like the ultimate violation of human dignity to us was, to them, sometimes the ultimate expression of love, devotion, and spiritual connection. This acceptance of necrophilia was part of a broader Egyptian comfort with practices that challenged conventional boundaries between life and death, sacred and profane, normal and taboo. Every culture has fertility festivals, but the ancient Egyptians approached agricultural celebration with a level of creative enthusiasm that would make modern festival organizers either take furious notes or call security. These weren't your grandmother's harvest celebrations. They were elaborate, weeks-long extravaganzas that combined religious devotion, agricultural thanksgiving, and activities that would require extensive legal disclaimers in any contemporary jurisdiction. The Festival of Opet, held annually in Thebes, was perhaps the most spectacular example of Egyptian fertility celebration. For nearly a month, the entire city transformed into what can only be described as ancient Egyptian Coachella, if Coachella had been organized by sex-obsessed agricultural deities, with unlimited budgets and no concept of public decency laws. The festival began with elaborate processions where statues of Amun, the king of gods, were carried from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple in ceremonies that involved thousands of participants. But this wasn't a solemn religious parade. It was a raucous celebration where participants wore costumes, played music, danced, and engaged in increasingly uninhibited behavior as the procession wound through the city. Along the processional route, temporary shrines were erected where worshippers could participate in fertility rituals designed to ensure the Nile's continued flooding and the land's productivity. These rituals involved activities that would make contemporary religious leaders lock their churches and reconsider their vocations. Participants engaged in public masturbation, group sex, and elaborate role-playing scenarios where they enacted the sexual adventures of various gods and goddesses. The beer consumption alone was legendary. Egyptian brewers worked for months preparing special festival ales that were distributed free to all participants. These weren't light beers, they were potent brews often mixed with psychoactive herbs that induced altered states of consciousness considered essential to proper fertility worship. The combination of alcohol, drugs, and religious fervor created an atmosphere where normal social inhibitions evaporated entirely. Archaeological evidence from festival sites reveals the scale of these celebrations. Excavations have uncovered massive kitchen facilities capable of feeding tens of thousands of people, temporary housing complexes that accommodated visitors from across Egypt, and specialized workshops where craftsmen produced festival supplies, including costumes, musical instruments, and what ancient texts delicately call ritual implements of pleasure. The Festival of Min took fertility celebration to even greater extremes. Held during harvest season, it began with the pharaoh personally demonstrating his sexual prowess in public ceremonies designed to ensure the land's continued productivity. But the royal performance was just the opening act. Ordinary citizens were encouraged to participate in their own fertility demonstrations throughout the festival grounds. Temporary pavilions were erected, where couples could engage in public lovemaking, while crowds cheered them on. These weren't crude exhibitions, they were considered sacred performances that channeled divine creative energy into the physical world. Participants underwent ritual purification, received blessings from priests, and were provided with specially prepared oils and aphrodisiacs to enhance their performance. The festivals included elaborate beauty contests where both men and women competed to embody various deities. Winners received prizes including gold, jewelry, and the honor of serving as fertility avatars for the duration of the celebration. These contests judged not just physical attractiveness but sexual prowess, with competitors demonstrating their abilities in contests that would make modern reality TV producers blush. Professional entertainers specialized in festival performances that combined acrobatics, dance, and explicit sexual displays. Troops of performers traveled throughout Egypt during festival season, offering shows that educated audiences about various sexual positions and techniques, while providing entertainment that was simultaneously arousing and spiritually uplifting. The festivals weren't just about human fertility, they celebrated the sexuality of animals as well. Sacred bulls were encouraged to mate publicly during ceremonies that were believed to ensure livestock productivity. Prize breeding animals were brought from across Egypt to participate in contests that judged both their physical perfection and their sexual performance. Economic records reveal that fertility festivals were major commercial events that generated enormous revenue for host cities. Merchants traveled from across the Mediterranean to sell goods, ranging from exotic foods to specialized sex toys. Local craftsmen worked year-round producing festival supplies, and entire industries developed around supporting the celebrations. The festivals provided opportunities for social mobility that didn't exist during the rest of the year. Slaves could participate as equals in many rituals, commoners could interact intimately with nobles, and social hierarchies temporarily collapsed in the pursuit of collective fertility worship. Some participants used festival connections to arrange marriages, business partnerships, or political alliances that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Foreign visitors left detailed accounts of Egyptian fertility festivals that range from shocked condemnation to enthusiastic participation. Greek and Roman observers were particularly fascinated by the Egyptians' ability to combine religious devotion with uninhibited hedonism, creating celebrations that served both spiritual and physical needs without apparent contradiction. The festivals included educational components where experienced practitioners taught sexual techniques to younger participants. These weren't crude demonstrations, but sophisticated instruction sessions that covered anatomy, psychology, and the spiritual dimensions of sexuality. Master teachers from temples across Egypt would attend festivals to share knowledge and learn new techniques from their colleagues. Women played central roles in fertility festivals that would have been impossible in most other ancient cultures. Female priests led major ceremonies, women competed in athletic and sexual contests, alongside men, and feminine sexual pleasure was celebrated as enthusiastically as masculine prowess. The festivals provided spaces where women could express their sexuality freely without social condemnation. The decline of Egyptian fertility festivals came gradually as foreign influences and changing religious attitudes made such celebrations controversial. Roman administrators found them disruptive and potentially seditious, while early Christian influences associated them with demonic worship and moral corruption. But for over 2 millennia, these festivals represented the ultimate expression of Egyptian beliefs about the connection between human sexuality and cosmic fertility. They were elaborate, expensive, and absolutely essential to maintaining the spiritual and agricultural health of the kingdom. The legacy of Egyptian fertility festivals reminds us that celebration of sexuality doesn't have to be crude or degrading. It can be joyous, spiritual, and community-building when approached with the right combination of reverence and enthusiasm. Which brings us to the question of what happened when all this sexual innovation met the practical realities of Egyptian medicine. Long before Viagra made pharmaceutical companies billions, ancient Egyptian physicians were developing sophisticated treatments for sexual dysfunction that would make modern sex therapists both impressed and slightly concerned about liability issues. Egyptian medical papyri contain hundreds of remedies for everything from impotence to premature ejaculation, revealing a culture that took sexual health as seriously as any other medical specialty. The Edwin Smith Papyrus and the Ebers Papyrus, two of our most complete sources for Egyptian medicine, dedicate substantial sections to sexual and reproductive health. These aren't folk remedies passed down through superstition. They're systematic medical texts written by physicians who understood anatomy, pharmacology, and psychology in ways that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 2,000 years. Egyptian doctors recognized that sexual problems could have physical, psychological, or spiritual causes, and they developed treatments that addressed all 3 dimensions. A man suffering from impotence might receive herbal medications to improve circulation, counseling to address performance anxiety, and ritual purification to restore his spiritual connection to the gods of fertility. The pharmaceutical arsenal was impressive. Egyptian physicians used over 60 different plants, minerals, and animal products in sexual medicine. Mandrake root was prescribed as an aphrodisiac and fertility enhancer. Honey mixed with crocodile dung was used as both a contraceptive and a treatment for vaginal infections. And modern analysis has shown that crocodile dung is actually quite effective as a spermicide, though we definitely don't recommend trying this at home. For male sexual enhancement, physicians prepared complex mixtures containing ingredients like powdered rhinoceros horn, ground pearls, and various herbs that we now know contain compounds similar to modern erectile dysfunction medications. These weren't random folk cures. They were carefully formulated drugs based on systematic observation of their effects over generations of use. The surgical techniques were even more remarkable. Egyptian physicians performed penis enlargement procedures using techniques that wouldn't look out of place in modern cosmetic surgery catalogues. They injected oils and other substances under the skin to increase girth, used traction devices to increase length, and even performed primitive implant procedures using materials like gold wire and ivory rods. Female sexual health received equal attention. Egyptian doctors developed treatments for what they called wandering womb, a condition where women lost interest in sex, which they believed was caused by the uterus literally moving around inside the body. Treatments included fumigation with aromatic herbs, massage with special oils, and exercises designed to encourage the womb to return to its proper position. Contraception was a major focus of Egyptian sexual medicine. Physicians developed pessaries made from honey, acacia gum, and various herbs that were inserted into the vagina before intercourse. Modern testing has shown that these ancient contraceptives were actually quite effective. Acacia gum contains natural spermicides, and the acidic environment created by fermented honey creates conditions hostile to sperm. For couples struggling with infertility, Egyptian physicians offered treatments that sound remarkably similar to modern fertility interventions. They tracked women's menstrual cycles, identified optimal times for conception, and prescribed diets and supplements designed to enhance reproductive health. They even developed primitive pregnancy tests using wheat and barley seeds. If the seeds sprouted when watered with a woman's urine, she was considered pregnant. The psychological aspects of sexual medicine were particularly sophisticated. Egyptian doctors understood that sexual problems often had emotional or mental causes, and they developed counseling techniques that addressed relationship issues, performance anxiety, and sexual trauma. Temple physicians specializing in sexual healing would spend weeks working with patients to identify and treat psychological barriers to sexual satisfaction. Surgical interventions for sexual problems included procedures that would challenge modern medical ethics. Physicians performed clitorectomies and other genital modifications that were believed to enhance sexual pleasure or solve specific problems. They also developed techniques for reconstructing damaged genitalia, particularly important in a culture where sexual function was considered essential to spiritual health. Pain management during sexual medical procedures relied on sophisticated anesthetics, made from opium, mandrake, and other psychoactive plants. Patients undergoing sexual surgery received drug cocktails that not only prevented pain, but often induced euphoric states that were considered therapeutically beneficial. Recovery treatments included massage, dietary supplements, and what can only be described as ancient Egyptian sex therapy. The training required to become a sexual medicine specialist was extensive. Physicians studied anatomy using dissected corpses, learned pharmacology through years of apprenticeship with master healers, and practiced psychological counseling under the supervision of temple priests who specialized in human relationships. The combination of scientific knowledge and spiritual wisdom produced healers whose skills were legendary throughout the ancient world. Medical records reveal that Egyptian sexual medicine achieved remarkable success rates. Fertility treatments helped couples who had been childless for years. Erectile dysfunction therapies restored sexual function to men who had given up hope, and relationship counseling saved marriages that seemed beyond repair. Foreign royalty regularly traveled to Egypt specifically to receive treatment from sexual medicine specialists. The integration of magic and medicine created treatment protocols that addressed both physical and spiritual aspects of sexual problems. A typical treatment might include herbal medications to address physical symptoms, ritual purification to cleanse spiritual blockages, and counseling sessions to resolve emotional issues. This holistic approach produced results that often seemed miraculous to contemporary observers. Documentation from Egyptian medical schools shows that sexual medicine was considered one of the most prestigious specialties, requiring years of advanced training and drawing the most talented students. Sexual medicine physicians commanded high fees, enjoyed royal patronage, and were consulted on matters ranging from individual treatment to national fertility policies. The decline of Egyptian sexual medicine came gradually, as religious attitudes changed, and foreign medical traditions gained influence. Greek and Roman physicians, while skilled in many areas, generally had more conservative attitudes towards sexuality and were less willing to develop specialized sexual treatments. But for over 3 millennia, Egyptian sexual medicine represented the pinnacle of ancient healthcare, combining empirical observation with innovative treatment techniques and holistic understanding of human sexuality. Their legacy influenced medical traditions throughout the Mediterranean and established principles of sexual health that wouldn't be rediscovered until modern times. The sophistication of Egyptian sexual medicine reminds us that human sexual health has always been a priority for thoughtful healers, and that innovation in this field is neither new nor shameful. It's an essential part of comprehensive healthcare. But all this medical and religious sophistication raises an important question. How did ordinary Egyptians actually live with all these elaborate sexual customs? Strip away the elaborate temple rituals and royal incest, and you'll find that ordinary Egyptians lived remarkably liberated sexual lives that would make many modern people envious. While pharaohs were busy marrying their sisters and priests were conducting elaborate fertility ceremonies, regular Egyptian citizens were navigating relationships with a freedom and openness that wouldn't be matched in most cultures for millennia. Marriage in ancient Egypt was refreshingly practical and equitable. Unlike many ancient cultures where women were essentially property transferred from father to husband, Egyptian women could initiate marriages, negotiate their own marriage contracts, and maintain independent legal and economic status throughout their relationships. Marriage wasn't a religious ceremony requiring divine approval. It was a civil contract between two people who decided they wanted to build a life together. Sexual compatibility was considered an essential component of successful marriage. Couples were encouraged to live together before making formal commitments, testing their physical and emotional compatibility without social stigma. If the relationship didn't work out, either party could dissolve it simply by declaring their intention to separate. Divorce didn't require elaborate legal proceedings or religious justification. It was as simple as one spouse moving out and dividing their possessions. Women had remarkable control over their reproductive choices. Egyptian society recognized a woman's right to decide when and whether to have children, providing access to contraception and abortion without requiring male consent or religious approval. Contraceptive techniques were sophisticated and widely available, ranging from herbal preparations to barrier methods that were surprisingly effective. Sexual education began early and was comprehensive. Egyptian children grew up in households where sexuality was discussed openly and practically. By adolescence, both boys and girls understood anatomy, contraception, and sexual techniques through formal instruction from parents, extended family members, and sometimes specialized teachers who provided education in the arts of love and relationships. The famous Turin erotic papyrus wasn't hidden away as pornography. It was an instructional manual that ordinary couples used to enhance their sex lives. Copies circulated widely, and the sexual positions and techniques it depicted were considered normal parts of married life rather than exotic practices reserved for the wealthy or religiously initiated. Archaeological evidence from ordinary Egyptian homes reveals fascinating details about domestic sexual culture. Bedrooms were often decorated with erotic art that served both as inspiration and instruction. Households maintained supplies of oils, perfumes, and other accessories for sexual enhancement. Even modest homes included spaces specifically designed for intimate activities, suggesting that sexual pleasure was prioritized across all social classes. Egyptian workers had sexual rights that were protected by law and social custom. Both men and women could take time off from work for sexual relationships, fertility treatments, and childbirth recovery. Employers who interfered with workers' sexual lives faced social censure and sometimes legal penalties. This recognition that sexual health affected overall productivity led to workplace policies that were remarkably progressive. Extramarital sexuality was handled with surprising sophistication. While marriage was valued and encouraged, Egyptians recognized that monogamy didn't suit everyone. Both husbands and wives could engage in outside relationships under certain circumstances, particularly if their spouse was unable to fulfill their sexual needs due to illness, travel, or other factors. These arrangements were often negotiated openly and incorporated into marriage contracts. Prostitution was legal, regulated, and socially accepted as a legitimate profession. Prostitutes weren't marginalized outcasts. They were skilled professionals who provided valuable services and commanded respect for their expertise. Many prostitutes accumulated substantial wealth and used their earnings to support extended families or invest in other businesses. Sexual festivals weren't just religious observances. They were community celebrations that brought ordinary Egyptians together for education, entertainment, and social bonding. Local festivals provided opportunities for young people to meet potential partners, for established couples to revitalize their relationships, and for community members to celebrate the role of sexuality in maintaining social harmony. Gender roles around sexuality were remarkably flexible. While men and women had different social expectations in many areas, sexual pleasure was considered equally important for both. Women were encouraged to pursue sexual satisfaction and were provided with resources and education to help them achieve it. Men who couldn't satisfy their wives faced social pressure to seek help or accept their wives' pursuit of satisfaction elsewhere. Egyptian law protected sexual autonomy in ways that were revolutionary for the ancient world. Rape was a serious crime punishable by severe penalties including castration or death. Sexual consent was required for all intimate activities, and both men and women could seek legal remedies for sexual assault or coercion. These protections extended to slaves and foreigners, suggesting a comprehensive commitment to sexual rights. Child protection laws were equally advanced. Sexual contact with children was strictly forbidden and harshly punished. Egyptian society maintained clear boundaries around appropriate sexual behavior and invested considerable resources in protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation. The integration of sexuality into daily life created a culture where sexual problems were addressed openly and practically. Couples experiencing difficulties could consult with physicians, counselors, or religious advisors without shame or secrecy. Sexual dysfunction was treated as a medical condition requiring professional attention rather than a moral failing to be hidden. Economic records show that Egyptians invested significantly in sexual health and pleasure. Households budgeted for contraceptives, aphrodisiacs, cosmetics, and other sexual accessories. The market for sexual goods and services was substantial and sophisticated, supporting numerous specialized professions and industries. Family structures accommodated diverse sexual arrangements. Extended families often included multiple generations living together, providing support systems for various relationship configurations. Children might be raised by biological parents, step-parents, or other relatives without discrimination based on the sexual relationships that created their family structure. The openness about sexuality extended to discussions of sexual problems and solutions. Egyptian literature includes frank discussions of sexual techniques, relationship advice, and solutions to common intimacy problems. These weren't hidden texts available only to specialists. They were popular literature that ordinary people read and discussed openly. This integration of sexuality into normal life created a culture where sexual satisfaction was considered a basic right rather than a luxury or privilege. Egyptians expected to enjoy fulfilling sex lives and created social, legal, and economic systems that supported this expectation across all social classes. The result was a civilization where sexual health contributed to overall social stability, where individual satisfaction was balanced with community responsibility, and where the pursuit of pleasure was harmonized with practical life management in ways that seem remarkably modern despite being thousands of years old. Not everything in ancient Egypt's sexual landscape was enlightened celebration and mutual pleasure. Like every human society, Egypt had its shadows, places where the progressive attitudes towards sexuality created opportunities for exploitation, where power imbalances led to abuse, and where the very openness that made sexual liberation possible also enabled those who would take advantage of others' vulnerability. The most troubling aspect of Egyptian sexual culture was the treatment of slaves and prisoners of war. While Egyptian citizens enjoyed remarkable sexual freedom and legal protection, these rights didn't extend to those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Slaves, particularly those captured in foreign wars, were considered property in the most literal sense, and their sexual autonomy was entirely subject to their owners' desires. Archaeological evidence from slave quarters reveals a grimmer reality behind Egypt's sexual sophistication. Female slaves were often purchased specifically for sexual services, their value determined partly by their physical attractiveness and perceived sexual skills. Male slaves faced the constant threat of castration, both as punishment for sexual offenses and as preparation for service in households where their masculinity was seen as threatening. The legal system that protected Egyptian citizens from sexual violence contained explicit exceptions for slaves. Rape laws that prescribed severe punishment for assaulting Egyptian women didn't apply when the victim was a slave. Sexual abuse of slaves wasn't just tolerated, it was considered a legitimate exercise of property rights, no more legally problematic than using a tool or consuming food that one owned. Even within the supposedly enlightened temple system, dark practices flourished. Some religious institutions that claimed to serve gods of love and fertility operated more like organized sexual exploitation networks. Young women from poor families were sometimes dedicated to temples where they were trained as sacred prostitutes, but the economic realities meant they had little choice in their clients or working conditions. The famous sacred prostitutes of Hathor's temples, while often portrayed as empowered religious figures, included many women who had been sold into temple service by desperate families or captured in raids and forced into religious sexual slavery. The elaborate training and comfortable living conditions described in some accounts applied mainly to elite courtesans who served wealthy clients. Many temple prostitutes lived in conditions that were barely above slavery. Egyptian medicine's approach to sexual enhancement sometimes crossed ethical boundaries that would horrify modern practitioners. Surgical procedures to alter genital appearance were performed not just on willing patients seeking improvement, but sometimes on slaves and prisoners to prepare them for specific sexual roles. These operations were conducted without anesthesia or consent, justified by beliefs about improving the victim's value or suitability for their assigned functions. The fertility festivals that brought communities together in joyous celebration had darker undercurrents that ancient sources rarely acknowledge directly. The combination of alcohol, drugs, and sexual abandon created environments where consent became murky and vulnerable people could be easily exploited. Archaeological evidence suggests that festival grounds sometimes became sites of sexual violence that was later dismissed as religious enthusiasm or misunderstood consent. Child protection, while more advanced than in many ancient cultures, had significant gaps that modern sensibilities would find appalling. The age of sexual consent was determined more by physical development than chronological age, meaning that children who appeared physically mature could be considered sexually available regardless of their emotional or psychological readiness. Marriage customs that allowed significant age differences between partners sometimes resulted in relationships that were essentially legalized child abuse. Wealthy older men could marry girls who had barely reached puberty, and while these marriages were technically legal and socially accepted, they represented a form of institutional sexual exploitation that was normalized by economic and social pressures. The Egyptian practice of royal incest, while religiously justified and carefully regulated, created family dynamics that must have been psychologically devastating for the individuals involved. Children raised specifically to marry their siblings had no choice in their most intimate relationships, and the pressure to produce heirs meant that personal preferences and sexual autonomy were entirely subordinated to dynastic necessity. Economic pressures created forms of sexual exploitation that were technically voluntary but practically coercive. Poor families sometimes prostituted their children to wealthy households, arrangements that were legally binding and socially acceptable despite being fundamentally exploitative. The economic desperation that drove these decisions doesn't diminish their harmful impact on the children involved. The medical system's treatments for sexual problems sometimes involved procedures that were essentially sexual assault disguised as therapy. Treatments for wandering womb included invasive examinations and manipulations that violated women's bodily autonomy in ways that would be considered criminal today. The medical justification didn't make these procedures less traumatic for the women who endured them. Foreign women captured in Egypt's frequent military campaigns faced systematic sexual exploitation that was considered a legitimate spoil of war. These women were distributed among soldiers and officials as rewards for military service, with no consideration for their consent or preferences. Their sexual enslavement was celebrated as part of Egypt's military success and imperial dominance. The Egyptian attitude toward sexual violence also had troubling aspects related to social class. While rape of Egyptian women was severely punished, The penalties were often based more on the victim's social status than the severity of the crime. Assaulting a nobleman's wife carried far harsher consequences than attacking a peasant woman, reflecting a justice system that valued property rights over human dignity. The dark practices weren't aberrations or deviations from Egyptian sexual culture. They were integral parts of a system that granted enormous sexual freedom to some while denying basic human dignity to others. The same society that celebrated sexual pleasure and innovation also created mechanisms for systematic sexual exploitation that destroyed countless lives. Understanding these shadows is essential to accurately assessing Egyptian sexual culture. The progressive attitudes and innovative practices that we admire were built on foundations that included slavery, exploitation, and institutionalized violence against vulnerable populations. The sexual liberation that benefited Egyptian citizens was purchased partly through the sexual enslavement of others. These contradictions remind us that sexual progress isn't always universal or equitable, and that advances in sexual freedom for some groups can sometimes come at the expense of others. The Egyptian example shows us both the potential for sexual enlightenment and the dangers of allowing that enlightenment to coexist with systems of exploitation and abuse. The legacy of Egyptian sexual culture includes both its innovations and its horrors, and understanding both aspects is necessary for learning from their example without repeating their mistakes. Egyptian sexual culture didn't exist in isolation. It was constantly interacting with, influencing and being influenced by the sexual practices of other ancient civilizations. As Egypt's trade networks expanded and its military campaigns reached across the Mediterranean and into Africa and Asia, Egyptian attitudes towards sexuality encountered dramatically different cultural approaches, creating fascinating exchanges that shaped sexual practices across the ancient world. The Greeks were among the most documented recipients of Egyptian sexual influence, and their reactions ranged from shock to enthusiastic adoption. Greek writers like Herodotus described Egyptian sexual practices with a mixture of fascination and moral outrage, particularly scandalized by the openness of Egyptian fertility festivals and the prominence of women in sexual and religious roles. But Greek fascination with Egyptian sexuality went deeper than mere curiosity. Many Greek philosophers and physicians traveled to Egypt specifically to study Egyptian approaches to sexual medicine and relationship dynamics. The renowned physician Hippocrates incorporated Egyptian contraceptive techniques into Greek medical practice, and Plato's discussions of ideal relationships show clear influence from Egyptian concepts about the integration of sexuality and spirituality. The Greek adoption of Egyptian sexual practices wasn't wholesale. It was selective and often modified to fit existing Greek cultural values. The Greeks embraced Egyptian medical techniques for treating sexual dysfunction, but were uncomfortable with the Egyptian acceptance of female sexual autonomy. They adopted Egyptian aphrodisiacs and sexual enhancement methods, while maintaining more restrictive attitudes toward women's sexual rights. Roman encounters with Egyptian sexuality were even more complex. When Rome conquered Egypt, Roman officials and soldiers were exposed to sexual practices that were both more sophisticated and more permissive than anything in Roman culture. The initial Roman reaction was typically condemnatory. They associated Egyptian sexual openness with moral decay and political weakness. However, wealthy Romans quickly developed an appetite for Egyptian sexual luxuries. Roman households began importing Egyptian sex toys, aphrodisiacs, and erotic art. Roman women in particular were drawn to Egyptian approaches to sexual pleasure and reproductive control, finding in Egyptian practices a level of autonomy that Roman law denied them. The influence flowed both directions. Egyptian sexual culture also absorbed elements from the various peoples who conquered, traded with, or migrated to Egypt. Nubian sexual practices, brought north through trade and military contact, introduced new techniques and perspectives that were integrated into Egyptian fertility rituals. Persian influences, following Alexander's conquest, brought different approaches to sexual enhancement and relationship structures. The most dramatic cultural collision occurred when Christianity began spreading through Egypt. Early Christian leaders were horrified by Egyptian sexual practices and launched systematic campaigns to suppress fertility festivals, close temples dedicated to sexual deities, and eliminate what they saw as pagan sexual corruption. The conflict between Christian sexual morality and Egyptian sexual culture created one of history's most dramatic cultural transformations. Practices that had been celebrated for millennia were suddenly redefined as sinful and dangerous. Temples were converted to churches, Fertility festivals were banned, and sexual art was destroyed or hidden away. But Egyptian sexual culture proved remarkably resilient. Rather than disappearing entirely, many practices went underground or were adapted to accommodate Christian sensibilities. Some fertility rituals were transformed into Christian festivals, with thinly veiled sexual elements. Egyptian medical knowledge about sexuality was preserved in monastery libraries, where monks secretly continued developing treatments for sexual problems. The Islamic conquest of Egypt created another layer of cultural negotiation. Islamic attitudes towards sexuality were more permissive than Christianity, but still more restrictive than traditional Egyptian practices. The result was a gradual transformation where some Egyptian sexual customs were preserved under Islamic interpretation, while others were eliminated entirely. Trade networks carried Egyptian sexual innovations far beyond the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence suggests that Egyptian sex toys, cosmetics, and medical preparations reached markets in India, Central Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Egyptian techniques for treating sexual dysfunction were adopted by medical traditions as far away as China, where they merged with local practices to create new hybrid approaches. The spread of Egyptian sexual culture had profound implications for women's status across the ancient world. In societies where women had few rights, the introduction of Egyptian concepts about female sexual autonomy and pleasure created pressure for social change. Some cultures selectively adopted Egyptian practices that enhanced women's sexual satisfaction while maintaining restrictive legal and social structures. Egyptian influence on ancient Jewish sexuality was particularly complex. Jewish communities in Egypt were exposed to Egyptian sexual practices, while simultaneously trying to maintain their distinct religious and cultural identity. The result was selective adoption of some Egyptian innovations, particularly in medical areas, while maintaining stricter moral codes in other aspects of sexuality. The legendary Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon was likely influenced by Egyptian diplomatic customs that included sexual elements. Ethiopian and Arabian cultures that interacted with Egypt absorbed Egyptian approaches to royal sexuality and fertility rituals, creating hybrid practices that combined local traditions with Egyptian innovations. Documentation from ancient Indian medical texts shows clear influence from Egyptian sexual medicine, suggesting that trade routes carried not just Egyptian goods, but Egyptian knowledge about sexual health and enhancement. Some traditional Indian sexual practices that are often assumed to be indigenous actually originated in Egypt and were adapted to fit local cultural contexts. The decline of distinctly Egyptian sexual culture was gradual but relentless. As successive waves of foreign influence transformed Egypt, the unique synthesis of spirituality, medicine, and sexuality that had characterized Egyptian culture for millennia was progressively diluted and suppressed. However, the influence of Egyptian sexual culture persisted in subtle ways throughout the Mediterranean world. Roman sexual practices retained Egyptian elements long after Egypt's conquest. Greek medical texts preserved Egyptian knowledge about sexual health. Even early Christian attitudes towards sexuality were shaped partly by reaction against Egyptian practices, creating a dialectical relationship where Egyptian influence persisted through opposition. The global spread of Egyptian sexual innovations demonstrates how powerful cultural ideas can transcend political boundaries and religious differences. Despite the efforts of various authorities to suppress or control sexual practices, the practical benefits of Egyptian innovations in sexual health, pleasure, and relationship dynamics ensured their survival and adaptation across diverse cultures. Modern archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the extent of Egyptian sexual influence on ancient civilizations. From British burial sites containing Egyptian-style sex toys, to Chinese medical texts incorporating Egyptian pharmaceutical recipes, the evidence suggests that Egyptian approaches to sexuality had global impact that we're only beginning to understand. The story of Egyptian sexual culture's global influence reminds us that human sexuality is too fundamental to be contained by political or religious boundaries, and that innovations in sexual health and pleasure will inevitably spread wherever human contact makes such transmission possible. The sands of Egypt have preserved more than just mummies and gold. They've preserved intimate details about ancient Egyptian sexuality that would make Victorian archaeologists clutch their pearls, and modern researchers reach for more sophisticated analytical tools. The archaeological evidence for Egyptian sexual practices is extensive, explicit, and often surprising in ways that challenge our assumptions about both ancient sexuality and the archaeologists who first uncovered it. The most famous piece of evidence is undoubtedly the Turin erotic papyrus, discovered in the early 19th century, and immediately locked away by embarrassed scholars who didn't know what to do with ancient Egyptian pornography. The papyrus contains 12 explicit scenes of couples engaged in various sexual positions, accompanied by text that appears to be both instructional and humorous. What makes it particularly significant isn't just its explicit content, but its artistic quality and the care with which it was preserved. This wasn't crude graffiti but sophisticated erotic art created by skilled artists. But the Turin papyrus is just the tip of the iceberg. Excavations throughout Egypt have uncovered thousands of erotic artifacts that reveal the central role sexuality played in Egyptian culture, from the massive temples of Karnak to modest village homes. Archaeologists have found evidence of sexual practices, beliefs, and innovations that paint a comprehensive picture of a culture that was remarkably open about human sexuality. Tomb paintings provide some of the most detailed evidence about Egyptian sexual attitudes. The tomb of Sekhmet, a priest from the Old Kingdom, contains detailed depictions of sexual encounters between humans and deities that were clearly intended to be viewed by visitors to the tomb. These weren't hidden or considered inappropriate. They were prominent features of expensive burial complexes, suggesting that sexual imagery was considered as appropriate for religious contexts as any other aspect of human experience. The archaeological evidence also reveals the sophisticated technology Egyptians developed for sexual pleasure. Excavations have uncovered hundreds of phalluses made from various materials, including stone, wood, bronze, and ivory. These weren't crude fertility symbols but carefully crafted objects designed for actual use, with attention to anatomical accuracy and user comfort that suggests considerable experience and feedback from users. Female sex toys are equally well represented in the archaeological record. Excavations at Deir el-Medina, the village where the workers who built the Valley of the Kings lived, uncovered numerous dildos and other sexual implements alongside the workers' personal possessions. The casual inclusion of these items with other household goods suggests they were considered normal domestic accessories rather than shameful secrets. One particularly fascinating discovery came from the tomb of a wealthy Egyptian woman, dating to the Middle Kingdom. Among her grave goods were several sophisticated vibrators, devices made from hollow reeds filled with live bees that would create buzzing sensations when applied to erogenous zones. The ingenuity required to develop such devices, and the social acceptance implied by their inclusion in a formal burial, speaks to a culture that prioritized sexual satisfaction and wasn't squeamish about technological innovation in intimate matters. Chemical analysis of residues found on ancient Egyptian sex toys has revealed sophisticated understanding of lubrication and sexual enhancement. Many artifacts show traces of oils mixed with herbs that modern analysis confirms would have had aphrodisiac or sensitization effects. The Egyptians weren't just making these tools, they were engineering them for maximum effectiveness using advanced knowledge of human physiology and pharmacology. Architectural evidence provides another layer of understanding. Excavations of Egyptian homes consistently reveal spaces specifically designed for intimate activities. These rooms were typically located away from common areas, equipped with specialized furniture, and decorated with erotic art. The consistent inclusion of such spaces across different social classes suggests that privacy for sexual activities was considered a basic household necessity. The famous workers' village at Deir el-Medina has provided unprecedented insight into the sexual lives of ordinary Egyptians. Ostraka inscribed pottery shards found throughout the village include love letters, sexual jokes, complaints about sexual performance, and advertisements for sexual services. These informal writings reveal a community where sexuality was discussed openly and humorously, without the shame or secrecy that characterized many other ancient cultures. Perhaps most remarkably, the archaeological evidence includes numerous examples of Egyptian sexual innovation that wouldn't be rediscovered in other cultures for centuries. Excavations have revealed primitive condoms made from animal intestines, intrauterine devices crafted from precious metals, and surgical instruments designed for genital modification procedures. The sophistication of these technologies suggests systematic research and development in sexual medicine that was far ahead of its time. Religious sites provide equally revealing evidence. Temples dedicated to fertility deities contain specialized chambers equipped for sexual rituals, including furniture designed to accommodate various positions and activities. The integration of these spaces into sacred architecture demonstrates how thoroughly Egyptians integrated sexuality into their religious practice. The preservation of organic materials in Egypt's dry climate has allowed archaeologists to analyze the actual contents of ancient Egyptian contraceptives and aphrodisiacs. Chemical analysis has confirmed that many Egyptian sexual medicines contained active compounds that would have been effective for their intended purposes. This wasn't superstitious folk medicine, it was empirical pharmacology based on careful observation and experimentation. Burial practices provide insight into Egyptian beliefs about sexuality and the afterlife. Many mummies were prepared with their genitals in states of arousal, and some were buried with their arms positioned to suggest masturbation. These weren't accidents or natural mummification effects. They were deliberate choices that reflected Egyptian beliefs about the continuation of sexual activity after death. The archaeological evidence also reveals the global reach of Egyptian sexual culture. Egyptian sex toys and erotic art have been found in archaeological sites throughout the Mediterranean, Africa, and Asia, carried by traders, diplomats, and migrants who spread Egyptian sexual innovations to other cultures. Modern archaeological techniques continue to reveal new aspects of Egyptian sexuality. Ground-penetrating radar has identified previously unknown chambers in Egyptian temples that appear to have been dedicated to sexual rituals. DNA analysis of mummy remains has confirmed the extent of royal incest and revealed information about Egyptian sexual practices that wasn't preserved in written records. The sheer volume and diversity of sexual artifacts in Egyptian archaeological sites is remarkable. No other ancient culture has left such extensive evidence of systematic attention to sexual pleasure and innovation. From massive temple complexes to modest household items, Egyptian sexuality left material traces that have survived for millennia. This archaeological evidence forces us to revise our understanding of ancient sexuality and acknowledge that Egyptian culture was far more sophisticated and open about human sexuality than most societies that followed. The material record doesn't lie. The Egyptians were pioneers in sexual technology, medicine, and cultural attitudes, who achieved levels of sexual sophistication that wouldn't be matched in many cultures until modern times. As we emerge from this journey through ancient Egypt's remarkably sophisticated sexual landscape, it's worth pausing to consider what lessons this ancient civilization might offer our contemporary world. The Egyptians managed to create a culture that was simultaneously deeply spiritual and unapologetically sensual, technologically innovative and psychologically astute, socially progressive and individually fulfilling in ways that many modern societies struggle to achieve. Perhaps the most profound lesson from Egyptian sexual culture is their integration of sexuality into every aspect of life, without reducing it to mere physical function. The Egyptians understood that sexual energy was fundamentally creative energy. The same force that created the universe could create art, build relationships, heal illness, and maintain social harmony. They didn't compartmentalize sexuality as something separate from spirituality, medicine, or politics. They recognized it as a fundamental aspect of human existence that influenced everything else. This integration produced remarkably healthy attitudes toward sexual diversity and innovation. Where many cultures developed rigid rules about acceptable sexual behavior, the Egyptians maintained flexibility that allowed for individual differences while still providing social structure. Their approach suggests that sexual health might be better served by inclusive frameworks that accommodate diversity rather than restrictive codes that attempt to control and limit human expression. The Egyptian emphasis on sexual education and open discussion created a culture where sexual problems were addressed practically rather than hidden shamefully. Their willingness to develop medical treatments, therapeutic interventions, and technological solutions for sexual difficulties demonstrates an approach to sexual health that treats it as seriously as any other aspect of well-being. This contrasts sharply with cultures that stigmatize sexual problems and leave individuals to suffer in silence. Their sophisticated understanding of consent and sexual autonomy, at least for Egyptian citizens, established principles that many societies still struggle to implement effectively. Egyptian women had legal and social risks to sexual satisfaction, reproductive choice, and relationship autonomy that wouldn't be matched in many cultures for millennia. Their example demonstrates that gender equality and sexual freedom can coexist with social stability and cultural achievement. The Egyptian approach to sexual medicine and technology reveals the benefits of treating sexual enhancement as legitimate healthcare rather than shameful vice. Their willingness to develop surgical procedures, pharmaceutical treatments, and mechanical devices for improving sexual function produced innovations that were centuries ahead of their time. This suggests that contemporary squeamishness about sexual technology and medicine might be limiting human potential for sexual health and satisfaction. Perhaps most importantly, Egyptian culture demonstrates that sexual celebration doesn't require social chaos. Their fertility festivals, sexual rituals, and erotic art existed within a highly ordered society that functioned effectively for over 3 millennia. The idea that sexual permissiveness leads inevitably to social breakdown is contradicted by Egyptian evidence showing that sexual liberation can actually contribute to social stability when properly integrated into cultural and legal frameworks. The Egyptian model also reveals the dangers of allowing sexual freedom for some while maintaining sexual oppression for others. Their treatment of slaves, prisoners, and other vulnerable populations shows how sexual liberation can become sexual privilege if it's not extended universally. This serves as a warning about the importance of ensuring that advances in sexual freedom benefit everyone, rather than creating new forms of sexual inequality. Their integration of sexuality and spirituality offers alternatives to contemporary cultures that often treat these as opposing forces. The Egyptian example suggests that sexual expression can be a form of worship, that physical pleasure can be a pathway to transcendence, and that honoring the body can enhance rather than diminish spiritual development. The Egyptian approach to sexual aging and life transitions provides models for maintaining sexual health throughout the lifespan. Their understanding that sexual needs and capabilities change over time, combined with their development of medical and technological solutions for age-related sexual changes, offers guidance for contemporary efforts to support sexual health across the entire human lifespan. Their comprehensive sex education, starting from childhood and continuing throughout life, demonstrates the benefits of treating sexual knowledge as essential life skills rather than dangerous information to be withheld. Egyptian children grew up with age-appropriate sexual education that prepared them for healthy adult relationships, suggesting that contemporary debates about sex education might benefit from Egyptian perspectives on sexual literacy. The Egyptian record also demonstrates the importance of preserving and transmitting sexual knowledge across generations. Their detailed medical texts, instructional art and educational traditions ensured that sexual innovations and insights were maintained and improved over time. This contrasts with cultures that allow sexual knowledge to be lost through prudishness or political interference. Their economic integration of sexual services and products shows how sexual commerce can function without exploitation when properly regulated and socially accepted. The Egyptian model of professional sex work, with trained practitioners who commanded respect and economic independence, offers alternatives to contemporary approaches that often criminalize or marginalize sexual commerce. Most fundamentally, Egyptian sexual culture demonstrates that human sexuality is too important and complex to be governed by simple rules or moral absolutes. Their nuanced approach, which balanced individual freedom with social responsibility, personal pleasure with spiritual meaning, and innovation with tradition, suggests that effective sexual policies require sophisticated understanding of human nature and cultural dynamics. The Egyptian legacy reminds us that sexual repression isn't inevitable or necessary for civilization. Their example proves that cultures can be highly advanced, socially stable, and morally sophisticated, while maintaining open, celebratory attitudes toward human sexuality. This challenges contemporary assumptions about the relationship between sexual freedom and social order. Their record also shows that sexual innovation and experimentation can produce genuine improvements in human well-being. When approached with scientific rigor and ethical consideration, Egyptian advances in sexual medicine, technology, and psychology weren't just curiosities. They were practical improvements that enhanced quality of life for millions of people over thousands of years. As we face contemporary challenges around sexual health, gender equality, and relationship diversity, the Egyptian example offers both inspiration and practical guidance. They demonstrate that many of our current sexual problems have been solved before, that human sexual potential extends far beyond what many cultures allow, and that integrating sexuality into broader social frameworks can produce remarkable cultural achievements. The ancient Egyptians didn't have all the answers, and their culture included practices that we rightly reject today, but their overall approach to human sexuality, comprehensive, innovative, spiritually integrated, and fundamentally celebratory, offers a vision of what human sexual culture could become if we had the wisdom to learn from their example and the courage to implement their insights in contemporary contexts. Let that sink in as you drift off to sleep, pondering a civilization that understood something essential about human nature that we're still trying to rediscover. Every revolution eventually faces counter-revolution, and ancient Egypt's sexual liberation was no exception. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process spanning centuries, as foreign influences, religious changes, and shifting political priorities slowly dismantled one of history's most sexually progressive civilizations. Understanding how and why this happened offers sobering lessons about the fragility of sexual freedom and the forces that can undermine even the most established cultural practices. The decline began subtly during Egypt's periods of foreign domination. When the Assyrians, Persians, and Greeks conquered Egypt, they initially allowed local customs to continue while gradually introducing their own values. These conquering cultures generally had more restrictive attitudes towards sexuality, particularly regarding women's sexual autonomy and public expressions of sexuality. Greek influence was particularly significant because it came wrapped in the prestige of philosophical sophistication and military success. Greek administrators and scholars who came to Egypt often viewed Egyptian sexual practices as evidence of moral decay and political weakness. They promoted the idea that Egyptian military defeats were divine punishment for sexual licentiousness, gradually undermining Egyptian confidence in their own traditions. The Greek approach to sexuality was fundamentally different from the Egyptian model, where Egyptians integrated sexuality into spiritual and social life. Greeks tended to compartmentalize it. Greek philosophy often portrayed physical pleasure as a distraction from higher pursuits, creating intellectual frameworks that justified sexual restriction as moral elevation. This philosophical challenge to Egyptian sexual culture was more devastating than direct prohibition, because it attacked the underlying beliefs that supported Egyptian practices. Roman conquest accelerated the transformation. While Romans weren't necessarily more sexually restrictive than Egyptians, they had different ideas about the relationship between sexuality and political order. Romans associated sexual regulation with social discipline and viewed Egyptian sexual festivals as potential sources of political rebellion. They gradually restricted public sexual celebrations while allowing private practices to continue. Roman law also introduced concepts of sexual morality that were foreign to Egyptian culture. The Roman emphasis on sexual behavior as a reflection of civic virtue created new categories of sexual crime and punishment that hadn't existed under Egyptian law. Practices that had been celebrated for millennia were gradually redefined as threats to public order. The most dramatic transformation came with the spread of Christianity through Egypt. Early Christian leaders saw Egyptian sexual culture as a direct challenge to their new religious vision. Christianity's emphasis on sexual purity, celibacy as spiritual ideal, and the inherent sinfulness of physical pleasure was fundamentally incompatible with Egyptian approaches to sexuality. Christian missionaries launched systematic campaigns against Egyptian sexual practices. They portrayed fertility festivals as demon worship, described temple prostitution as spiritual corruption, and presented sexual asceticism as the path to salvation. The Christian message appealed particularly to populations who felt marginalized by Egyptian sexual culture, including some slaves and foreigners who had been excluded from its benefits. The conversion of Emperor Constantine and the subsequent Christianization of the Roman Empire provided political backing for religious transformation. Egyptian temples were closed or converted to churches, fertility festivals were banned, and sexual art was destroyed. The legal and social frameworks that had supported Egyptian sexual culture for millennia were systematically dismantled. But the transformation wasn't just imposed from above. It also reflected internal changes within Egyptian society. Centuries of foreign domination had undermined Egyptian confidence in their traditional ways. Economic decline made the expensive festivals and elaborate sexual customs increasingly difficult to maintain. Political instability made public celebrations seem dangerous rather than joyous. The rise of monasticism provided an alternative model of spiritual achievement that appealed to many Egyptians. Christian monasteries offered certainty, community, and purpose to people who felt lost in the cultural confusion of late antiquity. The monastic emphasis on sexual renunciation became a powerful counter-narrative to Egyptian sexual celebration. Economic factors also contributed to the decline. The elaborate sexual culture of ancient Egypt required significant resources, temple maintenance, festival organization, medical specialists, and luxury goods, all cost money that increasingly scarce. As Egypt's economy declined under foreign rule, supporting traditional sexual customs became less feasible. The transformation of Egyptian sexual culture also reflected changing attitudes toward gender and power. The relatively egalitarian sexual relationships that characterized pharaonic Egypt were gradually replaced by more hierarchical models, influenced by Greek and Roman patriarchal traditions. Women's sexual autonomy was progressively restricted as foreign legal systems limited their rights and social roles. Medical knowledge about sexuality was particularly vulnerable to religious pressure. Christian leaders viewed many Egyptian sexual medical practices as witchcraft or demon worship. Medical texts were destroyed, practitioners were persecuted, and centuries of accumulated knowledge about sexual health and enhancement were lost or driven underground. The Arabic conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE completed the transformation. While Islam was more sexually permissive than Christianity, it still imposed significant restrictions on many Egyptian sexual practices. Islamic law prohibited public sexual displays, regulated prostitution, and established different frameworks for understanding the relationship between sexuality and spirituality. Some elements of Egyptian sexual culture survived the transformations by adapting to new religious and cultural contexts. Fertility celebrations were transformed into Islamic festivals, with thinly veiled sexual elements. Medical knowledge about sexuality was preserved in Arabic translation, where it merged with Islamic approaches to sexual health. Artistic traditions continued in modified forms that satisfied religious requirements, while maintaining some connection to earlier practices. The survival strategies also included geographical displacement. As restrictions increased in major cities and religious centers, some traditional practices continued in remote areas where enforcement was difficult. Rural communities maintained modified versions of fertility festivals and sexual customs for centuries after they had disappeared from urban areas. The decline of Egyptian sexual culture wasn't uniform or complete. Archaeological evidence suggests that some practices continued in hidden or modified forms. Well into the Christian period, private sexual customs, medical treatments, and artistic traditions showed remarkable persistence despite official disapproval. The transformation process reveals how cultural changes around sexuality often reflect broader shifts in political power, economic resources, and religious authority. Sexual practices aren't just personal choices. They're embedded in social systems that can be disrupted by external pressures and internal changes. The Egyptian example also demonstrates how sexual liberation can be vulnerable to philosophical and religious challenges that question its underlying assumptions. When the intellectual foundations of sexual culture are undermined, practical restrictions follow naturally. Understanding how Egypt's sexual revolution ended provides crucial insights into the forces that can threaten sexual freedom in any era. The Egyptian experience shows that sexual progress isn't automatically permanent, and that maintaining sexual liberation requires ongoing effort to preserve the cultural, legal, and economic systems that support it. And so we reach the end of our journey through the perfumed gardens and sacred brothels of ancient Egypt. Having explored a civilization that understood something profound about human nature that we're still struggling to rediscover. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps your dreams will be populated by golden phalluses and sacred lettuce, by goddess queens who ruled with divine authority and ordinary couples who celebrated sexuality as a gift from the gods themselves. What emerges from this exploration isn't just a collection of bizarre ancient practices, but a coherent vision of what human sexuality could become when freed from shame, integrated with spirituality, and supported by sophisticated cultural institutions. The Egyptians achieved something remarkable. They created a civilization where sexual pleasure was considered a sacred right, where sexual problems were treated as medical conditions requiring professional care, and where the pursuit of intimate satisfaction was harmonized with social responsibility and spiritual development. Their legacy challenges our contemporary assumptions about the relationship between sexuality and civilization. We've been taught to believe that sexual freedom leads inevitably to social chaos, that spiritual development requires physical denial, and that technological innovation in sexuality is somehow less legitimate than medical advances in other areas. The Egyptian example suggests that these beliefs might be limiting human potential rather than protecting social order. Perhaps most importantly, the Egyptian story reminds us that human sexuality is far more complex and creative than any single cultural approach can fully express. Their willingness to experiment, innovate, and adapt created solutions to sexual and relationship challenges that we're still trying to address. Their integration of multiple perspectives, spiritual, medical, technological, artistic, and practical, produced insights that no single-minded approach could achieve. The rise and fall of Egyptian sexual culture also demonstrates the fragility of sexual progress. Millennia of accumulated wisdom can be lost in decades of political upheaval or religious transformation. The knowledge and institutions that support sexual health and freedom require constant protection and renewal, or they can disappear as completely as the Egyptian fertility festivals that once drew participants from across the known world. But perhaps the most profound lesson from ancient Egypt is that human beings have always been creative, passionate, and determined to enhance their intimate lives through intelligence, technology, and cultural innovation. The Egyptians weren't content to accept sexual limitations as inevitable. They developed medical treatments, surgical procedures, technological devices, and social institutions that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in human relationships. Their approach to sexual diversity and individual differences offers models for contemporary efforts to create more inclusive and supportive sexual cultures. Rather than enforcing rigid conformity, they developed flexible frameworks that could accommodate various needs, preferences, and capabilities while maintaining social coherence and cultural meaning. The Egyptian record also reveals the importance of comprehensive sexual education and open cultural discussion of intimate topics. Their children grew up with age-appropriate knowledge that prepared them for healthy adult relationships, while adults had access to ongoing education and support throughout their lives. This contrasts sharply with cultures that treat sexual knowledge as dangerous information to be withheld or distorted. Their sophisticated understanding of the connections between physical health, emotional well-being, and spiritual development suggests that contemporary approaches to sexual health might benefit from more integrated perspectives. The artificial separation between body, mind, and spirit that characterizes much modern thinking would have seemed bizarre to Egyptians who understood these as interconnected aspects of unified human experience. The technological innovations of ancient Egypt remind us that human ingenuity in service of sexual satisfaction has deep historical roots. From their primitive but effective contraceptives to their elaborate pleasure enhancement devices, the Egyptians demonstrated that applying intelligence and creativity to sexual challenges can produce genuine improvements in human well-being. Their economic integration of sexual services and products shows how sexual commerce can function as legitimate business when properly regulated and socially accepted. The Egyptian model of professional sex work, with trained practitioners who commanded respect and economic independence, offers alternatives to contemporary approaches that often increase rather than reduce exploitation and harm. As you drift towards sleep, consider the possibility that some of our most intractable contemporary problems around sexuality, relationships, and gender equality might have been solved by a civilization that flourished thousands of years ago. The Egyptians developed approaches to sexual education, medical treatment, legal protection, and cultural celebration that produced remarkably positive outcomes across multiple domains of human experience. Their examples suggest that many of our current sexual struggles might reflect not the inherent difficulty of these challenges, but our failure to learn from successful historical examples. The wisdom accumulated over millennia of Egyptian sexual innovation remains largely untapped, because we've been taught to dismiss ancient cultures as primitive, rather than recognizing them as laboratories for human experimentation that can inform contemporary choices. The story of Egyptian sexuality is ultimately a story about human potential, about what becomes possible when cultures prioritize pleasure alongside responsibility, innovation alongside tradition, individual satisfaction alongside social harmony. Their achievements remind us that the limitations we accept as inevitable might actually be choices we could change if we had the wisdom to learn from their example and the courage to implement their insights. But it's also a cautionary tale about how quickly sexual progress can be reversed when political, economic, or religious forces align against it. The transformation of Egypt from sexual pioneer to sexual conservative demonstrates that freedom and knowledge require active protection or they can vanish, as completely as morning mist in the desert sun. As you settle into whatever dreams may come, perhaps you'll carry with you not just the amusing absurdity of masturbating gods and lettuce-obsessed fertility cults, but the deeper vision they represent, a civilization that refused to accept artificial limitations on human experience, that celebrated the body as enthusiastically as the spirit, and that created cultural institutions sophisticated enough to support both individual flourishing and collective harmony. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be as satisfying as the eternal slumber of Egyptian pharaohs, surrounded by golden phalluses and confident in the knowledge that pleasure, properly understood, is indeed a divine gift, worthy of celebration, protection, and perpetual innovation. Let that sink in and sleep well. If this journey through ancient Egypt's steamy secrets has left you both educated and exhausted, you know what to do. Subscribe for more historical deep dives that prove the past was way more interesting than your textbook suggested. Sweet dreams, you magnificent history nerds.